The rake is already warm in your hands before the sun has properly risen, because it has spent the night leaning near the furnace wall, drinking in the stored heat of yesterday's work. The handle is wood, darkened by sweat and brine and smoke, and where your palms settle into it, there are shallow, polished places, made by hands that have done the same motion so often the tool seems almost to remember. Outside, the air over the Sichuan basin still carries the damp coolness of morning, but inside the salt house, the world has already turned toward heat, and the first thing you notice is how little the day seems to care whether you are ready for it. The brine pans lie ahead of you in a low, smoky row, broad iron mouths set over the furnace fire, and each one holds a shallow, shimmering layer of water drawn from deep under the earth. It is not ordinary water, though it moves like water when the ladles disturb it, because it carries the mineral bitterness of buried stone, and when it boils it leaves behind the white, stubborn body of salt. The surface trembles, then clouds, then gathers into skins and flakes, and your work is to stand close enough to guide that change, raking the forming crystals before they scorch, clump, or settle too thickly on the hot iron below. There are quieter jobs in the Han world, jobs with more air around them, jobs where a person can look up from time to time and see a field, a road, a riverbank, or the pale line of hills. Yours is not one of those jobs, because the salt furnace asks you to stay near the fire, near the steam, near the hiss of brine drying into grain, while the walls hold in the warmth like a closed hand. The day begins with your sleeves tied back, your hair wrapped close and the rake angled across your body, while the first white crust gathers at the edge of the pan like frost in a place where frost could never survive. The furnace house smells of wet stone, hot iron, burnt fuel, and the strange sharpness of brine, a smell that settles in cloth and hair until even your sleeping mat carries it. Some furnaces burn wood or charcoal, and some, in the salt districts where deep wells also breathe out fire from under the ground, are fed by gas led through hollow bamboo pipes, a quiet marvel that still leaves the worker beside the pan with a very ordinary kind of discomfort. The flame may come from a hidden place far below, but the heat reaches your face plainly enough, and it dries your lips, tightens your skin, and makes the room feel smaller with every passing hour. You stand with your weight shifted slightly back, because the pan spits when the brine grows thick, and a small fleck of hot salt water can sting the wrist more sharply than one expects. The older rakers know the sounds of the pan almost as well as they know speech, because thin brine whispers and rolls, thick brine mutters and knocks, and the nearly finished salt makes a faint dragging noise when the rake passes through it. You listen for that change as much as you look for it, because steam blurs the eye, smoke makes the rafters soft and distant, and the surface of the pan is never still for long. The rake itself is simple, which is part of the burden, because simple tools do not spare the body, they only extend it. A long handle, a flat blade or toothed edge, a working end darkened by heat and mineral crust, and all day it moves from side to side, drawing salt toward the cooler edge, breaking mats of crystals, lifting and turning what the fire has coaxed out of the buried water. You are not striking, not lifting stones, not wrestling with oxen at the wellhead, and yet the work enters the shoulders slowly, almost politely, until the ache has made itself a home between the bones. The brine has come a long way before it reaches you, and in the morning quiet you can sometimes hear the other parts of the salt works waking around the furnace yard. Men at the well handle ropes and tubes, bringing up liquid from the dark seams beneath the earth, and others tend pipes, troughs, storage jars, fuel heaps, and accounts, each part of the place joined to the next by habit. By the time the brine touches your pan, it has already passed through many hands, and still it is unfinished, still thin and restless, still waiting for fire, patience, and the steady pull of your rake. In the Han salt districts, especially in the basin lands where brine wells could reach deep into the earth, salt was not merely a seasoning kept in a little jar near the cooking hearth. It was a necessity, a preservative, a trade good, a thing watched by officials and measured by clerks, because every household needed it and every government understood its value. That made your work part of a larger machine, though. The machine did not feel grand from where you stood, with sweat running into your collar and salt dust drying pale along your sleeves. The furnace raker's day is built from returns, and this is one reason it wears a person down without ever needing to hurry. Brine enters, water leaves as steam, salt gathers, rake passes, salt mounds, pan clears, more brine enters, and the same pattern begins again with only the smallest changes in temperature, thickness, smoke, and sound. If a stranger watched for a little while, they might think nothing much was happening, but you know that the work is full of narrow timings, and that salt left too long against the iron can harden into a crust that costs more labor to loosen than it ever saved. The floor under your feet is never quite clean, because salt works its way into every crack, and wet footprints dry into pale ghosts behind you. Around the pans, there are splashes, spilled brine, broken crystals, ash, stray fibers from baskets, and the fine grit that gathers wherever people carry things in from the yard. When you shift your stance, your sandals rasp softly, and that small sound becomes part of the room's pattern, along with the steam, the fire, the scrape of rake on pan, and the low voices of men who have learned not to waste breath near heat. To say that it sucked to be a Han salt furnace raker is not to make the work sound foolish, or to forget the skill inside it, because skill can live very quietly in a hard day. It sucked because the work was useful enough to be demanded, simple enough to be underestimated, and repetitive enough that the body had to pay attention even when the mind longed to drift. It sucked because you could not step away when the brine was turning, and because the fire did not soften itself for tired hands, and because the salt that fed the empire first found every small crack in your skin. There is a kind of sleepiness that comes not from rest, but from standing too long in heat, when the eyes feel heavy and the body wants to fold inward. You fight that sleepiness gently, not with drama, but with routine, by shifting the rake, clearing the pan edge, checking the thickness of the brine, and wiping your brow with the back of a wrist already damp again. The furnace house has no need for excitement, because the work itself keeps calling you back in small, exact ways, and each call is quiet, ordinary, and difficult to ignore. Near the doorway, a younger worker may carry in a vessel of brine, or scrape salt from the cooling boards, or squat for a moment beside a basket before someone asks him back to motion. He watches the older rakers because there is no better instruction than seeing how little force they seem to use, how they let the rake travel with the pan rather than against it. In time, he will learn that the gentler motion is not softness, but economy, because a person who fights the salt in the first hour may have nothing left for the hours after noon. The morning wears on, and the outside light strengthens, though inside the furnace house it arrives broken and dusty through doorways, smoke holes, and gaps in the wall. It touches the steam and turns it briefly silver, and for a moment the pan looks almost beautiful, as if the earth has offered up a shallow cloud and asked you to comb it into crystals. Then the heat returns to the center of your attention, and the beauty becomes work again, not gone exactly, but folded into the same motion your hands have made since dawn. You learn to read the salt by color, because new crystals are soft white, damp salt is grayish and heavy, and old crust near the hottest metal can take on a dull, stubborn shade. You learn that the pan has moods, though no one would call them that aloud, and that one corner may catch faster than another, while one place near the lip may cool just enough to gather a thicker rim. The rake finds these differences through the handle, and the hands receive them before the mind names them, which is how many old trades settle into the body. There are no clean edges to the discomfort, because one thing becomes another as the day moves. Heat becomes thirst, thirst becomes a dry mouth, the dry mouth becomes a headache, and the headache becomes a dull patience that follows the rake across the pan. Your tunic clings, then dries, then clings again, and the salt in the cloth stiffens it just enough that the fabric scratches when you turn, as though even your clothing has become part of the furnace. At intervals, someone brings water for the workers, and it tastes faintly of the vessel, faintly of smoke, and wonderfully plain against the bitterness in the air. You drink without ceremony, because the pan cannot wait long, and the next pass of the rake must happen before the surface sets too heavily. Perhaps there is a little millet porridge earlier in the day, or a piece of coarse-grained cake wrapped in cloth, and perhaps you eat it standing near the wall, where the heat is less direct but still present, like a person who has no intention of leaving. The salt itself is not gentle while it is being made, even though it will later sit quietly in jars and bowls. In the furnace house, it is sharp, wet, hot, granular, and always finding a way into places where it can irritate the skin. A small cut on the knuckle announces itself again and again, not loudly, not enough to stop the work, but enough to remind you that the body keeps an account of labor more honestly than any clerk. Beyond the furnace house, the Han world moves in its wide, layered way, with officials, farmers, merchants, soldiers, potters, weavers, cooks, carters, and children, all living lives that touch salt without seeing this room. Someone will use it to preserve fish or vegetables, someone will trade it along a road, someone will measure it as tax or ration, and someone will complain if it is damp, coarse, impure, or too costly. Almost none of them will picture you at the pan, drawing crystals from heat while the morning turns to noon, and that is part of why the work feels so hidden. Still, hidden work is not empty work, and there is a quiet dignity in knowing exactly what must be done next. The rake pulls toward you, the crystals gather, the edge is cleared, the damp salt is lifted, and the pan receives more brine, as if each action were one bead on a cord that stretches across the day. You may not own the salt, or the furnace, or the well, or even the schedule of your labor, but inside the motion there is a small territory that belongs to your attention. The furnace is built to keep heat where it can do the most work, which means it also keeps heat where you must stand. Its mouth glows low and steady, and the draft moves through it with a breathing sound, sometimes deepening when fuel is shifted or a flame takes more strongly beneath the pan. If the furnace uses wood or charcoal, ash rises when the fire is tended, and if gas feeds the flame through bamboo lines, there is still the same shimmering air above the pan, the same sense that the room has been tightened around your chest. The bamboo pipes themselves are a wonder from a distance, hollow lengths joined and sealed, carrying what the earth gives upward and sideways toward human use. Yet for the furnace raker, wonder is mostly something noticed in passing, because the pipe's cleverness does not cool the face or lighten the rake. A court scholar might admire the arrangement, and an official might praise the yield, but the person nearest the pan knows the invention by its heat, its noise, and the long hours it makes possible. You hear the brine arrive before you see it sometimes. A slosh in a channel or vessel, a shift in the room as another batch is prepared. Fresh brine lowers the pan's temper for a little while, and steam changes its smell, becoming wetter, heavier, and almost earthy before the salt begins to gather again. That short cooling is not rest exactly, but it is a change, and in a place ruled by sameness, even a change in steam can feel like a small kindness. The raking begins lightly at first, because thin brine offers almost no resistance, and the tool moves through it like a paddle through shallow water. Later, as crystals form and gather, the rake drags and whispers, then scrapes, then catches, and your shoulders adjust to each stage without being asked. If the pan is broad, you lean farther than is comfortable, and if the handle is long, the weight at the end reminds you how far your hands are from the work they are doing. By noon, the furnace house has lost the last of the morning cool, and the air seems to press downward from the roof beams. The rafters are dark, the walls are smoke-stained, and every tool has a place chosen less for neatness than for reach, because nobody wants to search for a paddle, scraper, ladle, or basket while salt is setting. The workers move around one another with narrow familiarity, passing close, turning sideways, making room without fuss, because the space has taught them manners more effectively than any elder could. A furnace raker has little use for wasted speech during the hottest part of the day, but that does not mean the work is lonely in a simple way. There are glances, nods, half-sentences, shared drinks, small complaints about a stubborn pan, and the quiet companionship of people who all know what the heat is doing. Sometimes a joke may pass softly across the room, worn smooth by repetition, and it is funny less because of the words than because everyone has heard it before and knows when to smile. The body finds ways to protect itself, though they are imperfect and humble. You stand at a slight angle to spare one shoulder, then change sides when the ache grows too sharp, and you grip the rake loosely enough to keep the hands from stiffening. You learn not to wipe your face with fingers that have touched fresh salt, not to lean too close when the pan is thickening, and not to trust a quiet surface too fully, because quiet brine can still spit when disturbed. There are seasons when the work feels different, though the furnace always makes its own weather. In damp months, the air outside is heavy, and the salt seems slower to dry, while in colder weather, the path to the furnace may bite at the hands before the doorway releases its stored blast of warmth. The change from outside to inside can be almost dizzying, and yet after a few breaths, the body accepts the furnace world again as if the rest of the air has been put away. The salt furnace does not give the worker a grand view of history, even when history is moving through the work in every basket and measure. Under the Han, salt and iron were drawn close to the state, watched, taxed, and organized, because rulers understood that small necessities could carry large power. To you, that power appears as rules, measures, overseers, quotas, and the sense that the white crystals drying under your rake belong to hands far beyond the furnace yard. An overseer does not need to shout to change the feeling of the room, because even quiet watching can make a worker's shoulders tighten. He may stand near the doorway with a tablet, a tally, or simply a practiced eye, noting how much salt has been drawn, how much brine has been boiled, and whether the pans are being kept in order. The raker keeps moving, not faster than the salt allows, but steadily enough to show that no time is being lost. This is another reason the work wears thin places in the spirit, because it demands both patience and proof of effort. You cannot hurry evaporation by wanting it, and you cannot slow your body too much without being seen. So you live between the pace of fire and the pace of authority. The brine changes when it changes, the salt gathers when it gathers, and meanwhile human expectation stands nearby, counting what the furnace has made. When the pan has given enough salt, you draw the crystals towards the edge in a damp, shining heap. The salt is heavy before it dries, heavier than people imagine when they later pinch it lightly between fingers, and it clings to the rake in a thick, white mass. Another worker may lift it into baskets or onto boards where heat and air can finish their quiet work, and you may pause only long enough to clear the blade before turning back to the pan. The finished salt is not all alike, and those who handle it every day notice differences the way a shepherd notices sheep. Some batches come coarse, some fine, some damp and reluctant, some clean and bright, depending on the brine, the fire, the pan, the timing, and the weather pressing around the salt house. A raker may take pride in a good batch, though that pride is usually silent, because the work's reward is not applause but the simple sight of the pan clearing well. Outside, people might imagine that salt is just found, gathered, and carried away, as though the earth offered it neatly. Inside the furnace house, you know it has to be persuaded out of water, watched through its stages, scraped from surfaces, dried, measured, stored, and protected from damp. The plainness of the final thing hides the labor inside it, which is true of many useful things, and perhaps this is why ordinary work so often goes unseen. During a slower moment, if the pan has just been refilled and the brine is still thin, you may look toward the doorway where daylight lies flat on the yard. There might be a dog nosing near a pile of fuel, a child carrying something too small to matter to the officials, or an old worker sitting with his back against a wall, stretching fingers that no longer straighten fully. The world beyond the furnace is not far away, but the heat between you and it makes it feel like a different country. The hands of an old salt raker tell the story before his mouth does. The palms are hardened, the knuckles roughened, the small cracks pale with mineral dust, and the nails may hold a stubborn grayness from ash and iron. If he takes the rake from you for a moment, perhaps to show a better angle, the tool seems steadier in his grip, and the motion becomes so smooth it almost looks easy, which is how hard work sometimes disguises itself after enough years. He might tell you not to scrape too deep when the salt is soft, because you will only trouble the pan and tire yourself. He might tell you to listen for the dulling sound, to watch the edges, to feel the drag rather than forcing it. These are small teachings, passed without ceremony, and they matter because the furnace does not forgive clumsiness quickly, though it teaches slowly if a person is willing to be humbled. In the worst hours, the work becomes a narrow world made of heat, glare, steam, and repetition. The eyes sting, the mouth dries, the shoulders ache, and the mind wanders in circles, returning again and again to water, shade, food, sleep, and the cool darkness of anywhere else. Yet the rake continues its path, because the pan is in front of you, the salt is forming, and the next motion is clear. There is a strange comfort in that clarity, even when the work itself is unpleasant. Many burdens become heavier because they are uncertain, but the furnace gives you a sequence, and the sequence gives the day a shape. You may dislike the heat, the brine, the overseer's tally, the sore hands, and the way your clothing stiffens with salt, but you do not have to wonder what the next hour asks of you. And as the afternoon settles into the furnace house, the room begins to feel less like a place where the day is passing and more like a place outside ordinary time. The same steam rises, the same fire breathes, the same rake moves, and the same white crystals gather where water has disappeared. Somewhere beyond the walls, shadows shift across paths and roofs, but inside, time is measured by pans emptied and filled, by baskets carried away, and by the slow, deepening ache in the arms. The salt raker's work also sucked because it was never truly clean, no matter how carefully it was done. Salt looks pure when it is finished, but making it is wet, smoky, gritty work, full of splashes, scum, ash, mineral traces, and the dull film that collects where steam meets dust. You might wash at the end of the shift, but the smell would remain, and even clean water could seem to wake the salt in your skin again. A person who spends the day near brine begins to notice dryness differently. The lips crack first, then the fingertips, then the places where cloth rubs at the neck or wrist, and every small irritation becomes sharper in the salthouse air. The discomfort is not a single wound or a single event, but a collection of little claims made on the body, each one modest, each one patient, and together they become the day's quiet tax. The fire asks for tending too, whether directly by the raker or by another worker close enough to share the heat. Fuel must be fed, draft watched, flame kept steady, and a pan boiled too low or too fiercely can waste labor just as surely as a lazy hand. The furnace is never only background, because it is the other worker in the room, tireless, hungry, and always ready to change the brine faster than a tired person expects. When natural gas is used, the flame can seem almost uncanny, fed by an invisible breath carried from the earth through bamboo. There is something remarkable in that, something people much later would still find impressive, but your own relationship to it is practical and close. If the flame is steady, the pan behaves. If it falters, the work slows. If it flares, the heat sharpens, and your face learns the news before anyone speaks. The bamboo pipes have to be watched, sealed, repaired, and respected, because a salt works is made from many fragile continuities. A leak, a blocked channel, a cracked vessel, a warped rake, a pan crusted too deeply, any of these can disturb the rhythm that the whole yard depends on. The raker may not manage every part, but he feels their failures at the pan, because the furnace is where upstream mistakes arrive in boiling form. The Han salt furnace is not a place of leisure, but there are still tiny rests hidden inside labor if you know how to receive them. A breath taken while fresh brine spreads across the pan, a shift of feet when another worker passes, a sip of water in the doorway's edge, a moment when steam thins and the outside hills appear pale beyond the yard. These are not breaks in the modern sense, not time given freely to the worker, but they are small openings, and the body learns to enter them quickly. By late day, the furnace house becomes golden in places where the sun finds smoke and dust. The heat is still fierce, but its color changes, and the bright white of the salt seems warmer, almost cream-colored, in the low light. You can smell evening approaching in the yard outside, damp earth cooling, fuel smoke spreading lower, and perhaps someone's cooking beginning far away. Though inside the furnace, the pan continues to ask the same patient question. How much longer? The body wonders, though the hands keep moving. How many more passes of the rake? How many more baskets? How many more times drawing the salt toward the edge before someone says the day's measure is enough? No answer comes from the fire, of course, and no answer comes from the brine. But the work has always been like this. A conversation in which only the worker asks and only the salt replies by changing form. The soreness of the day gathers in layers. The feet feel the floor, the knees feel the standing, the back feels the leaning, the shoulders feel the rake, and the hands feel every small catch of crystal against iron. None of it is surprising after a while, and perhaps that is part of the hardship too, because a discomfort that becomes familiar does not stop being discomfort. It simply becomes part of what the day is allowed to contain. Still, you continue, because the salt must be drawn before it hardens, and because everyone in the furnace house is held by the same practical necessity. A basket waits, a pan thickens, a flame moves under iron, a pipe brings brine, and the rake in your hands has only one purpose. There is something almost merciful in a tool with one purpose, because it does not confuse you, even when it tires you. As evening nears, the salt already made sits in damp mounds or shallow baskets, losing its heat slowly. If you pass near it, you can feel a faint warmth rising from the fresh crystals, as though the furnace has left a memory inside them. Later, when the salt is carried away, traded, stored, taxed, or cooked into someone's food, that warmth will be gone, and the crystals will seem as if they had always been cool and dry. The worker knows otherwise. You know the path from hidden brine to finished salt is not clean or quick, but made from fire. Waiting, scraping, lifting, carrying, and returning. You know that the whiteness of salt is not the whiteness of ease, but the whiteness left after water has vanished and labor has stayed behind. And when the last pan of your turn begins to clear, you do not feel triumph so much as release, a loosening that starts in the hands before it reaches the mind. The rake is scraped, the edge is cleared, the remaining salt is gathered, and the pan is left ready for whoever must tend it next. The furnace still glows, the air still trembles, and the salt house remains itself. But for you, for a little while, the work begins to let go. The handle leaves your palm reluctantly, because sweat and salt have made a kind of bond between skin and wood, and when you set the rake down, your fingers remain curved for a while. They open slowly, as if each joint needs to remember that it belongs to a hand and not only to the tool. The skin along the base of the thumb feels tender, rubbed smooth in one place and rough in another, and when you flex it, the salt hidden in the creases gives a small, bright sting. The furnace house does not empty all at once, because a place like this has too many needs to fall silent quickly. Someone still checks the pan lips, someone shakes loose a basket with a dry scrape, and someone else turns fuel or watches the flames settle into the evening pattern. You step aside rather than away, because even leaving has its order, and the work teaches you to move from heat toward air in careful stages, letting the cooler world return without shock. Outside, the yard feels wider than you remembered, though the buildings, wells, troughs, and fuel stacks stand exactly where they stood at dawn. Smoke hangs low over the ground and then lifts in soft layers, carrying the smell of burnt wood, mineral water, and cooked brine out toward the paths. The late light lies across everything with a dusty gentleness, and for a moment, the whole salt works looks less like a place of labor than a place that has been patiently breathing all day. Your ears keep the furnace with them after you leave it, just as cloth keeps the smell. The scrape of the rake seems to continue under the ordinary sounds of the yard, under voices, sandals, vessels, and the dull knock of someone setting down a wooden pole. A person can be away from the pan and still feel the motion in the shoulders, because the body has a long memory and it repeats hard tasks quietly even after the task has stopped. At the wash place, if there is water enough to spare for more than a quick cleaning, you rinse your hands and watch pale threads loosen from the skin. The water turns cloudy with ash and salt, and small cuts you ignored all day announce themselves one by one, not fiercely, but with the clear speech of tired flesh. You rub the wrists, then the forearms, and the scent of the furnace fades only a little, because some work does not leave with the first washing. The older workers do not hurry through this part, because they know that ending a shift too quickly can make the ache catch harder once the body cools. They sit or squat near the wall, rolling shoulders, pressing thumbs into palms, stretching fingers that have held a rake, rope, basket, or ladle for too many hours. There is talk, but it drifts rather than rises, and much of it is practical, about a pan that needs attention, a well that gave stronger brine, a pipe joint that should be watched in the morning. You may eat then if the day's order allows it, and the food tastes better because it is plain. Millet, beans, greens, a bit of pickled vegetable, perhaps a little rice if fortune has been generous, and always the awareness of salt, even when no one mentions it. The irony is gentle but hard to miss because you spend your strength making the thing that sharpens every meal, and yet by evening your own mouth may be too dry to enjoy it fully. This is one of the quiet sorrows of working close to necessity, that the thing everyone needs becomes, for you, not a symbol of comfort but a reminder of effort. Salt on food may please another person, but in your hands it is weight, sting, heat, and measure. Still, when a bowl is placed before you and the taste opens, simple and familiar, there may be a small recognition that your labor has traveled no farther than supper and still has arrived somewhere human. Night in the Salt District comes with its own routine, and the furnace may not rest just because the sky darkens. Some works keep fires going late or through the night when fuel, brine, demand, or official order makes stopping wasteful. If another crew takes the pans, their faces appear in the doorway with the same guarded look you wore in the morning, and the rake passes from one set of hands to another as quietly as a duty crossing a threshold. You know what waits for them, because you have just come from it, and that knowledge creates a small kinship without needing many words. They will stand where you stood, listen to the same boiling surface, and draw the same whitening grains from the same restless liquid. The furnace house will accept them with no ceremony, and soon their sleeves will darken, their faces will shine with sweat, and the fire will seem to have belonged to them all along. If your own time is finished, you walk away with the warmth still coming off your clothes. The road may be damp or dusty depending on the season, and the cooler air touches your face in separate layers. First the skin, then the breath, then somewhere deeper behind the eyes. You do not feel clean exactly, and not light exactly, but you feel the space around you widening, and the absence of the pan becomes a kind of quiet room inside the mind. A Han salt raker might sleep close to the works, in a worker's lodging, a family dwelling nearby, or whatever shelter the arrangement of labor allowed. The details would change from district to district, from state-run yards to local operations, from freer hands to conscripted ones, but the body's need would be the same. A mat, a low lamp, a bowl set aside, a folded garment stiffened by salt, and the immense pleasure of lying down where no pan asks to be cleared. Sleep would not always come easily, because exhaustion is not always soft. Sometimes the muscles twitch with remembered motion, and the hands curl again as if the rake has returned to them in the dark. The ears may invent furnace sounds from distant wind or household noise, and the nose may still hold the briny smoke so faithfully that even a clean blanket seems faintly touched by the day's work. Yet rest comes eventually, not like a door closing, but like steam thinning in the rafters. The thoughts that remain are practical ones, the kind that workers everywhere carry into sleep, wondering whether tomorrow's brine will be strong, whether the overseer will press for more, whether a sore wrist will ease by morning. These thoughts do not burn brightly. They drift and blur, and one by one they lose their edges in the ordinary mercy of tiredness. Before dawn, the salt works begins again in pieces. A rooster may call somewhere beyond the yard, or a cart may creak, or a worker may cough in the cold, and each sound comes softly through the dark. The furnace, if banked overnight, waits with a dull heart of heat, and if kept alive, it has never truly stopped, only passed from one human watchfulness to another, while the stars moved unseen above the smoke. Morning returns first, as sensation. The floor is cool beneath your feet, the air has a damp edge, and the garment you pull on carries yesterday's salt in its seams. You rub your hands together, feeling where the skin has tightened, and perhaps you pause over one sore place near the thumb, pressing it gently before wrapping the fingers around the day again. There is no need for a speech to begin the work, because the work has its own language. A vessel is lifted, a fire is opened, a pan is checked, and brine arrives with the small, heavy sound of liquid that has traveled up from darkness. The rake is where it was left, or near enough, and when you take it again, the handle fits your palm in the same old place, as though the night between shifts has been a brief misunderstanding. The first hour can be almost bearable, especially when the furnace has not yet claimed the whole room. Steam rises cleanly at first, and the air has not thickened into the full weight of the day, so the body moves with something like hope. The pan's surface rolls and trembles, and the brine looks brownish, grey, green, or clear depending on its source and the light, each batch carrying a small signature from the underground channels it has passed through. Salt wells in the Sichuan region were among the quiet marvels of early industry, though no worker at the pan would have called them that while trying to keep sweat from his eyes. The wells could reach deep, and the brine that came from them was part of a long craft of boring, lifting, channeling, boiling, and measuring, refined through many hands over generations. What later people might admire as ingenuity was, in daily life, a chain of tasks that began before sunrise and ended with sore backs, damp baskets, and white crystals cooling in the shade. The raker belongs near the end of that chain, close to the moment when liquid becomes something solid enough to store. That place in the process brings responsibility without much glory, because a mistake late in the work can spoil what many earlier steps prepared. If the brine is overheated, if the crust is neglected, if ash falls where it should not, if wet salt is handled carelessly, the loss may be small in a single pan but large across a season. So you watch, and watching is labor too. The eyes follow the skin forming on the surface, the little rafts of crystals turning at the edge, the foam that needs skimming, the change in shine when water gives way to salt. The untrained eye sees only boiling, but yours begins to see stages, and the stages become a quiet map by which your hands know where to go. The rake enters at an angle, not straight down, because the pan is not an enemy to be attacked. You slide, draw, lift, and settle, keeping the motion wide enough to move the crystals and measured enough not to splash the thickening brine over the edge. Each pass has a beginning, middle, and release, and when the work is going well, the tool seems to travel on an invisible path already laid in the steam. There are harder moments, of course, when a corner catches and the rake jolts in your hands. A crust can form where heat concentrates, and then the motion changes from guiding to loosening, from patient sweeping to careful pressure. You lean slightly, feel the resistance through your arms, and work the place free little by little, because forcing it too sharply may send hot brine outward or damage the pan surface that everyone depends on. That pan is a costly thing, even if it looks rough and ordinary after years of fire. Iron does not arrive without mining, smelting, casting, transport, and expense. And in a salt works it is expected to endure heat, brine, scraping, and constant use. The raker is therefore both worker and caretaker, using a tool against another tool, trying to gather the salt without wearing out the vessel that makes gathering possible. When the pan is in good order, the sound of the rake has a steady music, low and grainy beneath the higher hiss of steam. It is not a tune anyone would sing, but it can settle into the mind, and after many days the rhythm may become as familiar as footsteps on the path home. Work that repeats often creates its own weather inside a person, and the salt raker lives under that weather for long stretches, moving through heat with a patience made of necessity. The other workers have their own rhythms nearby. The person tending fuel bends and rises, keeping the furnace alive without letting it run wild, while the carriers move between brine source and pan and drying place and store. A clerk or overseer marks what can be marked, though so much of the day's real work slips past marks, hidden in timing, endurance, and the judgment of hands. There may be women in the wider salt economy too, depending on place and arrangement, carrying, sorting, packing, managing household tasks around the labor, and doing the many necessary things that records often leave pale or absent. Children might gather fuel scraps, bring food, watch animals, or run small errands near the edge of the works, learning the smell of salt before they understand its trade. A place of production is never only the workers at the hottest point, though the hottest point has a way of making itself the center of memory. As the day warms, the furnace house tightens again. Your breath becomes shallow for a while, then finds a steadier pattern, and the body accepts that comfort will not be available in any large amount. The mind, being merciful in its own strange way, begins to narrow itself around the next clear action, and the next, until the ache becomes background and the pan becomes foreground. A raker who lets his mind wander too far may miss the moment when the salt changes. Too early, and he wastes motion moving brine that is still too thin. Too late, and he fights a thickening mass that should have been guided sooner. This middle attention, neither tense nor careless, is difficult to describe to someone who has not done such work, because it is less like thinking and more like staying quietly near. The furnace also teaches humility through the weather of small failures. A gust may disturb the flame, a batch of brine may behave differently, a tool edge may loosen, or a worker may misjudge a moment because fatigue has made the eyes slow. No single trouble needs to become a disaster, but each adds a little burden, and the day's calm surface is held together by many small corrections. If brine splashes your sleeve, it dries into a pale patch that stiffens as the heat works on it. If it touches skin, you wipe quickly because even when it cools, the salt remains, and the day has enough small pains without inviting more. The skin around the wrists can become rough from exactly these little accidents, and by mid-season, some workers carry the furnace on their bodies as plainly as a soldier carries dust from a road. There is a reason salt has often belonged close to power. It is simple, needed, difficult to replace, easy to measure once made, and valuable enough that rulers, merchants, and households all care about its movement. In the Han world, debates over state control of salt and iron were not abstract matters for the people who stood in heat, because policy could become quotas, supervision, fixed prices, labor drafts, and long days beside the pan. Yet those larger arguments do not visit you in polished language. They visit as the amount expected, the hours required, the person watching the fuel gathered, and the salt carried away under someone else's authority. The empire is not a distant idea when it reaches your shoulders through a rake handle, though no one at the furnace house needs to say it that way. At times, the raker may notice the strangeness of producing something so small from something so vast. The underground brine comes from hidden channels, from layers of earth older than any village, and after all that buried time, it ends as grains that fit between fingers. You move those grains with a broad tool in hot air, and the scale of it shifts back and forth, deep earth to shallow pan, imperial revenue to sore thumb, ancient mineral to evening meal. This is part of the quiet beauty, though beauty does not cancel discomfort. The pan holds a little landscape of change, with foam islands, crystal edges, drifting skins, clear pockets, cloudy bands, and white mounds gathering where the rake has passed. If you were less tired, you might look longer, but even tiredness has its own seeing. And sometimes the worker notices what a visitor would miss, precisely because he has no time to admire it openly. By late morning, the furnace house is full of layered sound. Steam hisses, fire draws, wood settles, bamboo or clay lines creak faintly with heat, baskets scrape, sandals shift, and voices come softened by vapor. No one sound dominates for long, and together they become a woven covering over the day, something you live beneath, until silence later feels almost too wide. The brine in one pan thickens faster than expected, and you move there with the rake already angled. The crystals gather in heavy streaks, and the edge resists as though the pan has grown a second bottom made of damp salt. You work steadily, drawing the mass toward the side, loosening it in strips, letting the water drain back where it can, and keeping your shoulders low so the effort does not rise too quickly into pain. Another worker brings a basket lined or shaped for the damp salt, and together you shift the fresh mass from pan to holding place. It lands with a wet, granular sound, not a pure pour and not a solid thud, but something between the two. Steam rises from it briefly, and the smell is sharp enough to make your mouth tighten, though you have smelled it so often that you barely turn your head. The salt will dry, but not instantly. It must sit, drain, be turned perhaps, protected from dirt and too much damp, measured according to the practice of the place, and moved onward when ready. Even after the raker has drawn it from the pan, the process continues in quieter hands, because useful things often pass through several kinds of patience before they become ordinary enough to disappear into daily life. There are times when the salt forms beautifully, and even the tired workers can feel the ease of it. The crystals gather cleanly, the pan clears without stubborn crust, the basket fills well, and the overseer has little to complain about. On such a day, the work still sucks in the plain bodily sense, still hot, salty, repetitive, and wearing. But it carries fewer knots, and fewer knots can feel almost like kindness. Other days are not like that. The brine may be weaker, making the boiling feel long and unrewarding, or stronger, making it catch and crust before a tired person expects. Fuel may smoke badly, a pipe may fail, a pan may need scraping, or a worker may be absent, and then each remaining body seems to inherit a little more of the furnace. When extra work falls on you, it does not announce itself as a single heavy load. It arrives as fewer pauses, longer reaches, quicker turns, a late drink of water, and another pan to clear when your hands had begun to hope for rest. This is how hard days lengthen inside ordinary time, not by changing the sun's path, but by removing the little spaces where a person would have gathered himself. Still, there are habits that help you endure. You count rake passes for a while, then stop counting because the count grows too large to comfort you. You mark the day by batches, by drinks, by the change in light near the doorway, by the moment when your shadow shifts from one side of a post to the other. You think of food, then of sleep, then of nothing very shaped at all. And through all of it, the rake keeps finding its path. Sometimes you think of the salt after it leaves. You imagine it sealed in a jar, packed for transport, traded along a road, stirred into a pot, rubbed into fish, scattered over vegetables, or placed near a family hearth by someone who will never know your name. The thought is not grand, but it gives the labor a soft thread outward, and perhaps that is enough for one tired hour. Names vanish easily from old work. Records may preserve officials, regulations, quantities, prices, and arguments, while the raker at the pan remains only a shape behind production. But the body was there, the hand was there, the breath in the hot room was there, and every measure of salt passed first through someone's endurance before it became a number. By midday, if you are allowed to sit, the ground feels surprisingly firm, as though standing near heat has made the world uncertain. You lower yourself near the wall, not too far from the pan, and rest the rake against your knee while eating quickly. The food is coarse, but it steadies you, and the simple act of chewing gives the mind another rhythm slower than the furnace, closer to home. Around you, the salt works continues. A man laughs quietly at something said near the fuel pile. Two workers argue without much energy over a tool left in the wrong place, and a carrier walks past with his shoulder bent under weight. The whole place has the sound of people conserving themselves, because everyone knows the afternoon remains, and no one wants to spend strength merely proving they have it. After food, returning to the pan is sometimes harder than beginning at dawn. In the morning, the body had not yet fully remembered the work, but after rest, it knows exactly what it is being asked to resume. You take up the rake, feel the sore places meet the handle again, and there is a small inward sigh before the motion begins. The furnace does not notice that inward sigh. The fire continues, the brine trembles, the salt begins its pale gathering, and your own reluctance dissolves into the old sequence because sequence is stronger than mood. This may be one of the deeper lessons of such labor, that a person can continue without enthusiasm, held not by desire but by rhythm, duty, hunger, and the nearness of others doing the same. Afternoon light presses through smoke differently from morning light. It is thicker, warmer, and more slanting, and it catches in the steam so that the air seems filled with slow-moving dust and mineral breath. The pan surface shines under it, then clouds again, and the rake passes through that shine, as if crossing a small, heated sky. You begin to feel the day's salt everywhere. It is on your lips, in the lines of your palms, at the edge of your collar, in the cloth at your waist, and perhaps in the taste of the water you drink. Even the air seems seasoned, and when a breeze comes through the doorway, it feels almost sweet. Not because it smells sweet, but because it is not furnace air. The work's repetition can make memory loose. One batch resembles another, 1 hour folds into the next, and later, when someone asks about the day, you may remember only that it was hot and that the salt was heavy. But inside the doing there were countless distinctions, each too small to become a story, and together they made the real texture of the shift. A crack in the pan's crust, a basket handle fraying, a moment when steam parted and showed blue sky, a fly worrying at the edge of a wet salt heap, the way an old worker hummed once, almost under his breath, and then stopped when the overseer looked in. These small things passed through the worker like drifting ash, hardly important and yet somehow faithful to the day. The raker's world is made of such small noticing because large events are rare and, in truth, not wanted. A good day at the furnace is not exciting. It is stable, productive, free of breakage, free of injury, free of reprimand, and ordinary enough to end when expected. In sleep work, in field work, in shop work, in all the old repeated trades, peace often means nothing unusual has happened, and that can be a very precious kind of peace. As the afternoon deepens, the furnace mouth glows more visibly, though the heat has been there all along. The fire looks calmer than it feels, low and red in the shadows, with brighter tongues moving beneath the pan where the draft feeds them. You cannot see the whole of it from where you stand, only enough to be reminded that every white mound of salt has had flame beneath it. The pan thickens again, and you draw the rake across with the slow strength of someone who has learned not to hurry at the end of a movement. The crystals roll and gather, then spread, then gather again, leaving trails in the shallow liquid. Your arms complain, but not in a way that changes anything, and you answer them by shifting your grip, breathing through the next pass, and letting the tool do as much of the work as wood and iron can do. When the salt is ready to lift, you call softly or nod, and another worker comes close with a basket. There is a practiced choreography in this shared labor, not graceful in the courtly sense, but graceful in the way of people avoiding wasted motion. The rake draws, the basket tilts, the salt slides, the wet grains settle, and two bodies make room for one another without a word. For a moment, your face is close to the fresh salt, and the heat rising from it feels almost like a second breath from the pan. You can see individual crystals near the edge, irregular, cloudy, small as broken shell, each one made by water leaving. It is odd to think of absence becoming weight, of vanished steam leaving something that must be lifted, carried, taxed, and eaten. The day continues in that oddness, unnoticed, because it is constant. Water disappears upward, salt remains below, fuel becomes ash, strength becomes soreness, and time becomes measures stacked in baskets. The furnace is a place of transformations, but none of them happen with spectacle. They happen by staying close, applying heat, and repeating emotion until change becomes visible. This is what made the work both dull and demanding. There was little novelty to brighten the mind, yet there was always enough risk of error to prevent true drifting. The raker had to be present in a narrow, tiring way, neither fully alert with excitement nor free to wander inward. And that middle state can wear a person more deeply than people imagine. A clerk might count salt, but he would not count this kind of attention. An official might report output, but he would not record how many times a worker shifted his feet to keep from stiffening, or how often he swallowed against dry air. The small economies of survival rarely enter ledgers, though without them the ledgers would have nothing to measure. Toward evening, the furnace house begins again to loosen. Not cool, exactly, because the heat remains strong, but loosen. As outside air changes and shadows gather along the walls, workers begin to sense the end before it arrives, the way animals sense rain, through tiny changes in movement, tone, and expectation. No one says much, because hoping aloud can make the remaining work feel longer. You keep raking. The handle moves across the palms, the blade whispers through thickening brine, and the salt gathers at the pan edge in another damp mound. Your thoughts become slow and plain, not empty, but close to the ground, concerned with finishing cleanly, washing your hands, drinking water, and sitting somewhere where heat is not leaning on your face. The last stretch of a shift can be strangely tender, because every ordinary thing begins to promise rest. The doorway seems kinder, the water jar more generous, the evening road softer, and the thought of putting down the rake becomes almost as satisfying as sleep itself. This tenderness does not make the work easy, but it gives the ending a shape the body can move toward. When the final batch of your turn is drawn aside, you scrape the pan edge carefully, because leaving a mess for the next worker would be a small betrayal. Hard work makes people practical about kindness, and sometimes kindness is only a cleared edge, a tool placed within reach. a warning about a stubborn corner or a little water left in the vessel. These things are not grand, but in a furnace house they are understood. You set the rake down again, and this time the fingers uncurl even more slowly than before. The room continues around you, but you are no longer at its center, and the shift of responsibility feels like a weight sliding from one shoulder to another. You step back, wipe your face, and let the pan belong to someone else, while the white salt you made sits cooling nearby, like a quiet proof of what the day has taken and given. Outside, dusk has touched the yard. The fuel piles are dark shapes, the brine vessels have lost their shine, and smoke moves low enough that the world beyond the works appears softened at the edges. You breathe in, and the air is still not clean in any perfect way, but compared with the furnace it feels wide, cool, and almost sweet. The pathway may pass the wells, where the earth's hidden water begins the whole long sequence again. In the fading light, the wellhead looks plain, maybe even modest, with ropes, frames, tubes, and worn ground marked by many feet. It is hard to believe that such a place can draw up the taste of ancient seas, or that your day has been spent turning that buried memory into something a household will sprinkle into soup. A worker passing the other way nods, and you nod back. There is no need to explain the day to him, because the salt on your clothing and the tiredness in your walk explain enough. He may be going to the night work, or to check a line, or to fetch something left near the furnace, and for a breath, you are both simply figures in the same dim yard, joined by a trade that asks more than it says. The sky above the basin deepens slowly. Smoke, mist, and evening blend together, and the low buildings of the salt works become less exact, as if the day's sharp edges are finally being filed down. Somewhere a meal is being prepared, and somewhere a child calls, and somewhere the furnace continues to breathe behind you, because necessary work often outlasts the person who has just finished doing it. When you reach the place where you can sit, the body lowers itself with care. The knees bend, the back releases, and the shoulders, freed from the rake's long line, seem to fall a little farther than you meant them to. You hold your hands out before you, palms upward, and in the fading light, they look pale in the creases, dusted with the work of the day. There may be pride there, though it is not a pride that stands tall or speaks loudly. It is the pride of having endured the ordinary, of having kept the pan from crusting, the salt moving, the rhythm intact, and the day from breaking into trouble. Many people call such work unskilled, because the motions are simple to name, but naming a motion is not the same as surviving it from dawn until dusk. The raker's knowledge lives below speech. It lives in the grip that loosens before a splash, the eye that sees thickening before it fully shows, the stance that saves the back by a finger's width, and the ear that hears when boiling has changed its mind. It lives in calluses, in timing, in the patience not to force what heat has not yet prepared. As darkness settles, the salt house glows from within. The doorway holds a reddish light, and figures move across it now and then, passing through steam like shadows inside a lantern. The sound reaches you more softly at this distance, and because you are no longer standing in the heat, it almost becomes peaceful, though your body knows too much to be fooled completely. Still, there is peace in distance. The same furnace that oppressed you all day now marks the yard like a hearth seen from outside, and the same scrape of tools that filled your ears now comes softened by air. Work often changes shape when one steps away from it, and for a little while the salt house can look gentle, even though tomorrow it will ask for the same strength again. You eat, drink, wash what can be washed, and prepare for sleep while the night gathers around the salt district. The salt in your skin quiets after a while, the hands stop pulsing, and the ache in the shoulders spreads into a dull warmth that belongs almost to rest. The day has been long, but it has a finished edge now, and finished edges matter to people whose work is made of repetition. Before sleep, perhaps you hear someone outside carrying a vessel, or a cart moving late, or the low sound of workers near the furnace changing places. These noises do not fully wake you, because they belong to the world you know, and familiar labor makes a kind of rough lullaby when you are no longer the one doing it. The furnace breathes, the brine waits, the salt cools, and the night receives each sound without hurry. In the dark, the salt works continues as a pattern more than a place. Wells below, pipes and troughs above, pans over flame, rakes in tired hands, baskets filled and carried, measures counted, meals seasoned, bodies sleeping and waking to begin again. You are only one person inside it, but for one day's salt, at one furnace, in one narrow ring of heat, your attention held the pattern together. And this is why the work could feel so heavy in its quiet way, because nothing about it was rare enough to excuse complaint. And yet everything about it was steady enough to wear a life down grain by grain. It was not a tale of sudden danger or splendid hardship, only heat and brine and supervision and sore hands, repeated until the days began to resemble the salt itself, small crystals gathered from a great evaporation of time. The world needed what you made, but need did not make the furnace cooler, and usefulness did not keep the salt from stinging where the skin had opened. Morning would come again, pale and damp, and the rake would wait where it had been placed. The handle would still fit your palm, the pan would still tremble above the fire, and the brine would still carry its buried mineral patience toward the surface. You would stand in the doorway for a breath, feeling the first warmth reach your face, and then you would step inside, because the salt was not yet salt, and the day had begun asking for you again. Inside the furnace house, the first breath always reminds you that yesterday has not truly ended, because heat remains in stone, iron, ash, and air. The room has slept less than you have, and the pans seem to hold the memory of every boiling, every scraping, every white crust drawn toward the lip. You step carefully across the damp floor, avoiding the places where brine has dried into slick patches, and the rake comes into your hand with the quiet certainty of an old obligation. The morning crew speaks in low voices while the first vessels are set in order. A carrier bends under brine, another worker checks the channel, and someone near the furnace mouth stirs the fuel until the red beneath the ash grows brighter. It is still early enough that the outside world feels blue and cool, but here the color of the day is already changing, warming toward copper, grey, and the pale white that will gather later in the pans. You watch the first pour spread across the iron, thin and trembling, and for a moment it looks harmless. It reflects the roof beams in broken lines, then shivers as the heat reaches it from below, and little movements begin at the edges before the whole surface wakes. The sound is soft at first, almost like rain heard through a wall, though you know that softness will thicken into hiss, mutter, and scrape before the morning is half spent. There is a tenderness in the first pass of the rake, because the brine has not yet become heavy enough to resist you. The tool glides through the liquid, leaving only a faint path that closes behind it, and your shoulders accept the motion without complaint for a little while. This is not rest, but it is the nearest the job comes to gentleness, the brief opening before salt takes shape and the day begins to lean its full weight on your hands. The younger workers may think the hard part is only strength, because strength is visible, and the rake looks like something a strong person should simply drive through the pan. But the old rakers know that the hardest part is staying steady, neither too eager nor too slow, and letting the brine become ready before asking it to move. A pan teaches timing through discomfort, and a person who refuses that lesson spends more effort than the salt requires. As the brine warms, faint foam gathers in small islands near the edges. You draw the rake lightly, more to disturb than to collect, and the surface folds around the blade with a soft mineral shine. The smell changes too, from damp and earthy to sharp and cooked, and the air above the pan begins to rise in wavering layers that make the far wall seem farther away than it is. The furnace house is built around usefulness, not comfort, and everything in it tells you so. The doorway is where goods and bodies must pass, the pans are where the heat can reach them, the tools hang or lean where hands can find them quickly, and the roof lets smoke out imperfectly because perfect escape is not always possible. The whole place seems arranged by need, and need has never been especially gentle with the people who serve it. Still, workers make small comforts wherever they can. A smooth stone near the wall becomes a seat, a bit of cloth wrapped around a handle softens a sore palm, and a certain corner, though still warm, catches a stray breath of air in the afternoon. No one calls these luxuries, but everyone knows them, and in a hard place such humble mercies become part of the secret map of getting through. The first salt of the day gathers slowly, like mist deciding to become ground. Tiny crystals form in the brine, drift, join, sink, and rise again with the boiling, until the surface loses its clear shine and takes on a cloudy grain. You begin to draw the rake with more purpose then, feeling the first drag at the blade, and your hands adjust by memory before the thought is fully formed. The pan edge must be kept clean, because old crust invites new crust, and new crust can steal heat or trap salt where it should not stay. You work along the rim with patient strokes, loosening what has begun to cling and guiding it toward the place where it can be lifted. The motion looks repetitive from a distance, but each pass answers a slightly different condition. And that difference is where the worker's judgment quietly lives. When the salt thickens, the room grows brighter in a strange way. The fire is below, the daylight is outside, yet the white crystals seem to make their own dull light, reflecting steam and flame until the pan becomes a low, shining field. You stand over it with bent arms and a damp collar, and the beauty of it is close enough to hurt, because it exists exactly where the heat is strongest. Someone passes behind you carrying an empty basket, and you step aside without looking. Your bodies understand the pathway, the width of a shoulder, the reach of a tool, the turn needed near the pan, because repetition has given the group a shared sense of space. In a tight furnace house, courtesy is not decorative. It is how people avoid burns, collisions, wasted motion, and anger made worse by heat. A day can be measured by how often anger is swallowed. The furnace makes tempers rise the way it makes steam rise, and even gentle people can become sharp when thirsty, watched, and saw. But most words are kept low, because every worker knows that a quarrel burns strength without making salt, and strength is something the day will ask for steadily until dusk. The brine thickens, and the rake grows heavier in your hands. You draw the forming salt toward the side, pause just long enough for liquid to run back, then draw again, keeping the mound from spreading too thin. The damp grains gather with a faint tearing sound, like wet cloth dragged over a board, and the pan shows dark beneath them for a moment, before fresh brine clouds the surface again. A carrier lifts the salt away, his hands moving quickly because damp salt is not patient in a basket. It clings, slumps, drains, and leaves white traces along every surface it touches, marking the path from pan to drying place as plainly as chalk. Later, someone may sweep, scrape, or rinse what can be cleaned, but the salt works never truly loses these marks, because the work itself is always writing them again. The government may claim the salt, a merchant may carry it, a cook may use it, and a family may depend on it through lean months. Yet, at this moment, it is simply a hot, wet weight being lifted from one place to another by tired people. History often becomes easier to understand when it is brought down to the size of a basket, because power, trade, and necessity all have to pass through hands. You return to the pan. The next pour of brine enters with a low splash, and steam rises more thickly, carrying the sour mineral smell into your face. For a little while the pan is thin again, and the rake slides freely, but your body knows this ease is temporary, and it does not spend much hope on it. Through the open doorway, you can see the well yard in fragments. A line, a pole, the shoulder of a worker, the dark mouth of a vessel, a patch of trampled earth, and beyond that the low shapes of buildings under the morning haze. Everything is connected to the furnace, though the connections are partly hidden, as if the whole salt works were a single body and the pan only the place where its breath becomes visible. The deep brine wells are patient in a way people are not. They do not hurry, do the deep brine wells and not complain, and do not care who owns the yield, who counts the jars, or whose hands crack in the process. They hold their mineral water underground until human effort finds it, and then the work of raising, carrying, and boiling begins, turning geologic slowness into daily fatigue. You may never see the deepest parts of the work, the drilling, the repairing of shafts, the careful tending of bamboo lines, or the arrangements that bring gas and brine from below. But you feel their success or failure in the pan. Strong brine means one kind of day, weak brine another, and a troubled supply means waiting near heat without producing enough to satisfy anyone. Waiting can be its own kind of labor. If the brine is late, you do not simply rest as you might wish. because tools must be checked, edges cleared, old salt loosened, baskets prepared, and the fire watched so it neither wastes itself nor dies too far back. A working place finds tasks to fill its pauses, and the worker learns that the absence of one motion rarely means the absence of work. When brine returns, everyone feels the rhythm tighten again. The carrier's steps quicken, the furnace tender adjusts the flame, and you take your place beside the pan, with the rake angled across your body. There is no announcement, only the small collective shift of attention that says the process has resumed, and the day, having hesitated, is flowing forward once more. The heat does not strike all at once, it gathers around you with patience. It warms the shins, the face, the palms, the throat, and the spaces under folded cloth, until the entire body feels wrapped in air that has been used too many times. Sweat comes, dries, returns, dries again, and each drying leaves the skin a little tighter beneath its film of salt and smoke. You learn to protect the eyes by turning at certain moments, blinking before steam thickens, and never leaning into a pan that has begun to mutter too deeply. The steam carries more than water, and after hours of it the eyelids feel heavy, the lashes damp, and the world faintly blurred at the edges. Even so, you keep watching, because the salt announces itself first in subtle changes, and subtle things require eyes that are tired but faithful. The furnace raker's suffering is ordinary enough to seem almost invisible. There is no single heroic task, no heavy gate raised in one effort, no great beam lifted while others cheer. There is only the repeated drawing of salt from a hot pan, and the slow spending of the body in motions that anyone can describe and few would wish to repeat for long. In that ordinariness there is a harder truth. Many of history's most necessary jobs were not spectacularly terrible, but steadily wearing, designed by need rather than cruelty, yet capable of making a person feel older by the end of a season. The salt furnace belongs to that quiet family of work, where the hardship lies not in one dramatic danger, but in the way discomfort becomes routine. A supervisor comes through near the middle of the morning. His robe or tunic may be cleaner than yours, though the salt works leaves traces on everyone who spends enough time near it. He looks at the baskets, the pan, the fire, perhaps the tally, and although he says little, his presence changes the air in a way no doorway breeze could manage. You do not resent him in any simple way, or perhaps you do, depending on the day. He has his own orders, his own anxieties, and his own place in the long chain of obligation, but he is not the one whose palms burn against the rake. The structure of work can make people stand close together while living at different distances from the heat. After he passes, the room exhales a little. Someone mutters softly, someone else smiles without showing teeth, and the rake continues its work as if nothing happened. In a place ruled by output, even feelings learn to move in short, practical channels, appearing briefly and then disappearing beneath the next necessary action. The pan has caught at one corner. You feel it before you see it, the rake catching with a dull, stubborn halt that travels through the handle into the wrist. You shift your stance, loosen your grip, and work the edge free in several small passes, because forcing too hard would only punish the pan, the tool, and your own tired arm. When the crust breaks loose, it comes away in thick flakes, white and grey, damp below, and dry at the surface. You draw them toward the lifting place, careful not to scatter them into the fire gap, or onto the floor where dirt waits. The successful loosening brings no celebration, only a slight easing in the shoulders, the kind of relief that lasts until the next place catches. This is how the day offers reward, in small absences of trouble. A pan does not scorch, a basket does not split, a splash misses the wrist, the flame steadies after a smoky hour, and the brine proves strong enough to make the waiting worthwhile. Such rewards are quiet, but to a tired worker they are real, and sometimes the difference between a bearable day and a bitter one lies almost entirely in them. By noon, the world outside has become bright, and the doorway looks like a rectangle of another life. Dust moves in the sunlight beyond it, and the open air seems almost too clean to belong to the same day. You may glance that way while the fresh brine spreads, and the glimpse gives you a little rest, not because it changes anything, but because the eyes are allowed to travel farther than the pan. Food comes in a wrapped cloth or rough bowl, and you eat where the wall gives shade, The taste is plain, the portion not luxurious, and your fingers leave faint salt marks on whatever you touch. You chew slowly at first, then more quickly when the pan begins to call you back, because even hunger must make terms with boiling brine. There is a deep unfairness in food eaten too quickly by those who make something essential for other meals. But the thought passes without sharpening, because the day has no room for long bitterness, and bitterness is tiring in a body already tired. You swallow, drink, wipe your hands as well as you can, and rise toward the heat again with the small reluctance of someone who has done this many times. The afternoon begins with heavier air. The furnace seems to have gathered all the morning's heat and stored it for this return, and the first breath back near the pan feels thick in the chest. You lift the rake, set the blade into the brine, and the old pattern resumes, carrying you past the first resistance of the mind. In time, the work becomes almost dreamlike, though it is not sleep. The same surfaces repeat, the same sounds return, and the same motions flow through your shoulders until the line between one batch and the next becomes soft. You are present because the pan demands presence, yet part of you moves elsewhere, perhaps to a shaded path, a childhood room, a riverbank, or the memory of cool water poured over the hands. The furnace pulls you back whenever the salt gathers. The rake drags more heavily, the crystals mound, and the body remembers that imagining shade does not clear a pan. You draw the white mass inward, watching it fold and settle, and the mind comes home to heat, tool, edge, basket, and the clear duty of the moment. A worker beside you coughs, not loudly, just enough to show the smoke has found him. He turns his head, spits into the dust near the wall, and returns to the fuel without complaint, because complaint would not change the draft. Smoke, steam, and brine share the room with you all, and every breath is partly work, even when the hands are still. The air under the roof grows dimmer as smoke stains the light. Rafters disappear into shadow, then appear again when steam thins, and drops of condensed moisture sometimes gather where heat meets cooler wood. A place like this is always changing between wet and dry, hot and damp, bright and dim, and the worker's clothing passes through all of those states before the day is finished. Your tunic rubs at the shoulder where salt has dried into the cloth. At first it was only a small stiffness, but now each reach of the rake wakes it, and the skin below grows tender in a narrow line. You adjust the cloth, but the relief is brief, because the next pass pulls it back into place, and the small irritation rejoins the larger company of aches. No one writes poems about such rubbing, perhaps because it seems too minor, yet minor discomforts can fill a day completely when they repeat without permission. A cracked lip, a stinging finger, a wet sandal, a smoky eye, a rough seam, a thirst that returns too soon, these are the grains from which the hardship is made. Like salt itself, the burden is small in each piece and heavy in the measure. The pan clears, fills, clears again. A basket is carried away, another comes, and the drying area grows pale with the day's production. The salt mounds sit in rows or heaps according to local habit, each one cooling slowly, each one a little record of heat made visible and labor made portable. If you had time to follow one basket, you would see the work continue beyond your hands. Salt must be drained, broken, dried, sorted, packed, guarded, weighed, and moved through the channels that belong to household, market, or state. It will leave behind the furnace, the raker, the smoke-stained wall, and the hand that drew it together, and that leaving is part of its purpose. The day's middle wears on. Shadows outside shorten and then begin their long return, though inside the furnace house the change comes more slowly, filtered through smoke and heat. You know the sun is moving because the doorway light shifts along the floor, reaching one stain, then another, and finally the leg of a basket that has sat there since morning. A small insect lands on the damp edge of the pan and vanishes too quickly for you to think much about it. The furnace house is full of such tiny endings, drops turning to steam, fuel becoming ash, brine becoming salt, strength becoming fatigue, and moments disappearing before they can be held. None of this is dramatic in the room itself. It is simply the way a hot day uses what it is given. You keep your face turned slightly away when a fresh pour hits the pan. Steam rises at once, softer at the edges and dense in the center, and it wraps your hands, forearms, and chest in damp heat. For a moment, the world shrinks to whiteness, and then the cloud lifts enough for the surface to appear again, trembling under the rake. The rhythm returns. Slide, draw, lift, settle, and again. Not a chant, not a song, only the repeated shape of motion, held inside muscles that no longer ask whether they are willing. A worker may survive many kinds of work by ceasing to argue with each motion, and the raker learns this without being taught, because argument wastes breath, and breath is precious near the pan. There is skill in not using all the strength you have. A young worker spends effort openly, arms tense, shoulders high, face tight, while an older one keeps strength hidden until the crust demands it. The furnace teaches this difference slowly, through soreness, mistakes, and the quiet shame of tiring too early in front of people who have already learned. You may have been that young worker once. Perhaps you entered the salt house believing the job was only heat and scraping, something hard but plain, and perhaps the first days humbled you with their length. The rake that looked simple became awkward, the pan that looked shallow became demanding, and the salt that looked light became heavy when lifted wet from boiling brine. Over time, the place shaped you. Your stance widened, your grip softened, your eyes learned the surface, and your breath found a rhythm that could last longer than impatience. None of this made the work pleasant, but it made you less helpless inside it, and sometimes competence is the only comfort a hard job offers. The afternoon brings a small trouble with one of the fuel lines or fire beds, and the pan loses strength for a while. The boil weakens, the surface dulls, and everyone near that furnace becomes aware of the delay without needing an explanation. A worker crouches to adjust the source of heat, another clears ash or checks a join, and you wait with the rake resting against the pan edge, feeling the strange unease of a pause you did not earn. When the fire recovers, the brine answers slowly, then all at once, bubbles rise, steam thickens, and the salt begins again, as if the interruption were only a held breath. You start the rake gently, because the surface has changed during the pause, and the first strokes must find what the heat has done in your absence. Such interruptions can make the day feel longer than steady labor. When work flows, the body can lose itself in rhythm, but when the rhythm breaks, fatigue rises into awareness like sediment stirred from the bottom. You remember your feet, your back, your thirst, and the hours still remaining, and then the pan calls you back before self-pity can settle too deeply. The salt yard outside is busy in a muted way. Goods move, but not with the quickness of a market street. Workers pass, but not with the leisure of walkers. Voices sound, but most are low and functional. Everything has the character of necessary movement, and the whole place seems to labor under a single slow pulse. A raker knows that the finished salt must be kept from too much damp, because salt returns eagerly to water when given the chance. Rain, mist, careless storage, leaking roofs, or wet containers can undo the clean dryness that fire worked so long to create. This is another small insult of the trade, that even after brine has surrendered its crystals, the world remains ready to soften them back into trouble. So the storage areas are watched, covered, arranged, and repaired. Boards are set, mats spread, baskets lifted off wet ground, and workers glance at the sky in seasons when weather can make fools of careful labor. The raker may not manage all of this, but he understands the threat, because he has spent the day separating salt from water and does not wish to see them reunited too soon. Late in the day, the crystals seem larger, or perhaps your eyes are simply tired enough to notice them differently. They gather along the rake's edge in ridges, slide with a wet shimmer, and settle into mounds that lose their brightness as the liquid drains. Each mound carries a small shadow, and in the slanting light the pan becomes a landscape of white banks and dark channels. The work has a way of making the world very small and very large at once. Small, because you are held between pan, rake, basket, and flame, with no room for distant thoughts to remain useful. Large, because the salt you make belongs to roads, armies, kitchens, storehouses, government accounts, winter supplies, and the long human need to keep food from spoiling. You do not need to think all of that while raking. In fact, it may be easier not to. The hand continues, the shoulder turns, the blade moves, the salt draws inward, and the great systems beyond the furnace reduce themselves to one manageable strip of pan cleared before it crusts. Sometimes a visitor comes through, someone from outside the daily circle, and he looks at the furnace with curiosity. He sees fire, steam, salt, tools, and sweating workers, and perhaps he understands a little, but not the longness of the hours or the way the heat occupies the bones. A place of labor can be observed in a moment, but it can only be known through time, and time is what visitors usually do not spend. When the visitor leaves, the room returns to itself. The raker's world is not improved by being noticed briefly, though the attention may linger for a few breaths, like a draft from the doorway. Then the pan thickens, the rake catches, and whatever thought you had about being seen disappears into the immediate problem of moving salt before it hardens. As evening comes nearer, the fire seems louder. Perhaps the room is quieter, perhaps the body is more hollow, or perhaps the day's sounds simply have fewer places to go. You hear the draft pulling beneath the pan, the little collapses of fuel, the hiss where a drop meets heat, and the dry whisper of salt crystals dragged over iron. These sounds become intimate after many shifts. They are not pleasant in themselves, but they are known, and known sounds can hold a person even in discomfort. A sudden silence would trouble you more than the steady hiss, because silence near a furnace might mean something has gone wrong, while noise means the process is still alive. The last light outside turns the smoke above the yard a muted gold. Workers' faces look older in that light, lined with ash, sweat, and the day's fatigue, and for a little while everyone seems carved from the same warm grey material. You see another raker smile at nothing in particular, perhaps because his pan has cleared well, perhaps because the end is close, or perhaps because the body sometimes makes small lanterns for itself without asking permission. You draw another batch together. The salt is thick, and the rake moves with a slow, stubborn drag that pulls through the arms into the back. You do not hurry it, because hurrying at the end of the day can make the hands careless, and carelessness near hot brine is rarely kind. The basket comes, the salt is lifted, and the pan shows its dark iron bottom in patches before more brine takes the place of what was removed. The sight of the pan bottom always feels like a brief answer, proof that the work has cleared something, even if the answer vanishes almost immediately beneath the next pour. There are many jobs where completion is temporary, and the salt raker lives among them, clearing a surface that is meant to cloud again. A tired mind can find meaning in temporary completion. It does not need the whole world to stay finished. It needs one pan edge cleaned, one basket filled, one tool set down in good order, one evening reached without serious harm. The scale is modest, but modest scales are where most human days actually unfold. The overseer returns to look over the late production. He counts or estimates, speaks to someone near the store, and glances at the pans with a face made unreadable by habit. You keep working, not with fear exactly, but with the bodily awareness that watched labor and unwatched labor are different, even when the motions are the same. Perhaps the amount is acceptable today. Perhaps it is not. Either way, the salt that exists has come through heat, and no mark on a tablet can show the exact cost of each mound. The records will keep quantity and perhaps quality, but they will not preserve the salt drying on your sleeves, the ache in your left shoulder, or the little burn near your wrist that you will notice properly only after dark. When the shift loosens, you clear your pan with deliberate care. The blade travels along the edge, lifting stubborn grains, smoothing the place where old crust likes to begin, and leaving the surface ready for the next use. This final attention matters because neglect compounds in a furnace house, and tomorrow's discomfort often begins as someone's small laziness today. You rinse or scrape the rake if the practice allows, removing what you can before the salt hardens on it. The tool looks ordinary in your hand, perhaps too ordinary for the life it has taken from you hour by hour. You lean it back in its place, and there is relief in the small sound it makes against the wall, a wooden note that means your hands may finally be empty. Empty hands feel strange after a day like this. They seem light but also useless for a few moments, as if the rake has left an invisible handle across the palms. You open and close the fingers, feeling stiffness move through them, and the air against your skin feels cool wherever sweat has not already dried. You step outside. The evening has deepened, and the furnace heat follows you only a little way before the yard takes it from your clothing. The first cooler breath moves across your face, and you receive it without drama, as one receives a cup of water, gratefully and because the body knows need before the mind speaks. The salt works at dusk is not silent. It murmurs with late tasks, with storage, with counting, with the moving of baskets, with animals shifting, and with workers leaving or arriving according to the demands of the place. Yet compared with the furnace, the yard feels spacious, and even its noises seem to have room around them. You walk past the drying salt, and in the low light the mounds look soft, almost like snow brought into a warm country by mistake. They are not soft, they are coarse, damp in the middle perhaps, sharp in the hand, and full of the day's vanished water. Still, the eye rests on them gently, because white things in evening light often borrow peace from the air around them. One mound may have come from your pan, though by now it is difficult to say which. The day's work has already begun to lose its individual marks, blending with the labor of others into the common store. This is another quiet lesson of the salt furnace, that much human effort is necessary precisely because it can be joined, mixed, measured, and carried away without a name attached. You pass the wellhead again, and the thought of depth returns. Far below, beyond the reach of ordinary sight, brine rests or moves through hidden places, carrying dissolved salt from old stone and vanished waters. Above, men haul, guide, boil, rake, dry, and count, turning that hidden mineral world into a visible trade that smells of smoke and leaves cracks in the skin. A person could spend a life at one point in that chain and still never hold the whole of it in the mind. Perhaps that is true of most work, and perhaps it is enough to know one's portion well. The raker's portion is the pan's edge, the changing brine, the rake's pull, the judgment of when to move and when to wait, and in that narrow portion there is more knowledge than a passer-by would guess. At home or in the worker's lodging, the evening body is slower than the morning body. Sandals come off, cloth is loosened, and every movement makes some hidden soreness speak. You may wash again if water is there, rubbing the salt from the wrists and forearms, though the deeper smell of the furnace seems to have entered the day itself, and cannot be rinsed away completely. The lamp, if one is lit, gives a gentler light than the furnace. It sits quietly rather than roaring upward, and its small flame makes shadows that do not demand anything from you. After a day spent beside heat that consumes fuel, water, and strength, a household lamp can seem almost merciful, using so little and asking only to be left undisturbed. You eat slowly now, or as slowly as hunger permits. The food is warm, the bowl steady, and the salt in it is no longer a hot burden but a taste, spread through broth, grain, greens, or preserved pieces of something saved for this purpose. The transformation is almost too simple. What hurt your hands all day now makes the meal whole, and the body accepts the contradiction because it is too tired to argue. Someone may speak of ordinary matters. A neighbor, a tool, a debt, a relative, the weather, a child's cough, the price of something, the behavior of a mule, the condition of a roof. These small concerns do not feel separate from the salt furnace, because life is not divided neatly. The wage, ration, obligation, and fatigue from the day enter every quiet conversation at night. But there may also be silence, and silence can be welcome. Not the uneasy silence of a stopped furnace, but the soft silence of people eating, resting, and letting the day settle out of them. In that silence, you hear the smaller sounds of home or lodging, the scrape of a bowl, the movement of cloth, the breath of someone nearly asleep, and the night insects beyond the wall. The hands are still rough. You look at them in lamplight and see salt's small work written there, not as a single wound, but as a geography of use. Lines, cracks, pale places, dark places, a blister hardening near the base of a finger, and the old callus that no longer hurts unless the day has been especially long. You might rub oil, fat, or some simple household remedy into the skin, if such comfort is available. It helps a little, and a little matters. The skin softens, the sting quiets, and the hands regain enough of themselves that they seem less like tools attached to you and more like your own again. Sleep waits nearby, but before it comes, the mind may drift back to the pan, not because you wish to return, but because the day's motion has worn a groove deep enough for thoughts to run along it in the dark. The rake draws, the salt gathers, the basket tips, the steam rises, and the pattern repeats behind closed eyes until the mind slowly loses interest and lets it fade. This is one of the hidden costs of repetitive labor, that it does not always stop at the edge of the workplace. The body carries it home, the mind replays it, and dreams may take the shape of pans that never clear, or salt that gathers endlessly under a hand too tired to move it. Yet even these dreams are usually dull rather than frightening, heavy rather than sharp, and in their dullness they reveal how completely the work has entered the worker. If sleep comes deeply, it is a gift beyond accounting. The body falls into it with the trust of something used hard and finally set down. Outside, the salt district continues in dim ways, a furnace still breathing somewhere, a watchman crossing the yard, a late worker washing his arms, the wells standing dark and patient beneath the stars. Before dawn, the cycle begins again without needing permission from anyone's dreams. The coldest hour touches the roofs, mist gathers in low places, and the first worker awake hears the old sounds returning one by one. A vessel shifted, a cough, a footstep, a rope drawn taut, a fire stirred under ash, and then the day's earliest steam rising like breath from the earth's hidden salt. You wake with stiffness already present. The body has not forgotten, and sleep has repaired only what it could reach in the hours given. Still you rise, because rising is part of the work as surely as raking, and the first motion of the day may be simply sitting up with hands that feel older than they are. The garment waits. It may be cleaner than yesterday's, or it may be the same one dried overnight, carrying its faint mineral stiffness back to your shoulders. You dress, wrap what needs wrapping, eat if there is food, drink if there is water, and step toward the salt works in a morning that belongs to everyone, and yet already feels claimed by the furnace. The path is quiet at first. The ground holds the night's coolness, and the air smells of damp earth, smoke from banked fires, and the faint sour edge that always seems to linger near brine. If there are birds, they call from beyond the working yard, and their sound is almost startling in its lightness, so different from the low enclosed breathing of the pan house. At the doorway, warmth touches you before you enter. It comes out in a slow, invisible sheet, carrying yesterday, today, and perhaps every day the furnace has been alive. You stand there for no more than a breath, enough to feel the contrast between outside air and inside labor, and then you pass through because hesitation does not cool the pan. The rake waits, the fire wakes, the brine comes. These things are not dramatic, yet they are complete, and each one finds its place in the pattern before the sun has lifted fully above the basin haze. Your hands close around the handle, and the first small sting of salt in the skin is like a reminder spoken softly by the work itself. Fresh brine spreads in the pan, and the morning begins where so many mornings have begun. The surface trembles, steam rises, and the rake moves through thin liquid with a quiet, temporary ease. Around you, the salt house fills with the sounds of people entering the old rhythm, and the day opens not like a gate, but like a long road already familiar beneath the feet. It would be easy, from far away, to make the raker's job into a single picture: a man by a furnace, a tool in his hands, steam around his face. But life inside the picture is slower and more crowded than that, full of repeated judgments, small pains, brief mercies, and the steady pressure of a substance everyone needs. The truth of the work lies in the hours, and the hours cannot be hurried without becoming false. So the morning does what mornings do. It moves across the yard, brightens the smoke, warms the packed earth, and finds the salt mounds left from earlier work. Inside, it touches the pan edges, the handle of the rake, the damp collar at your neck, and the first crystals forming in the brine, each one catching light for a moment before being drawn into the day's labor. You breathe, shift your feet, and make the next pass. The rake slides through the thickening surface, and the salt begins to answer, gathering in pale lines that follow the tool's patient path. It is not easy, not comfortable, and not kind to the skin. But it is known, and for now the known thing is in front of you, asking only that you continue. And you do continue because the pan does not ask whether continuation feels noble, only whether the salt has been moved before it clings too long. The first pale lines spread and thicken, and the rake draws them inward with the same slow care as yesterday, while the fire below keeps its even hunger. You feel the work settle around you again, not as surprise, but as weather, as if the furnace has been waiting to place its warm hands on your shoulders. The morning's first baskets fill more cleanly than expected, and that small favor changes the mood of the room by a quiet degree. No one celebrates, but the carrier's step seems a little smoother, and the work attending flame does not have to bend quite so often to correct it. In a trade where so many discomforts arrive without asking, a clean batch of salt can feel like a little mercy given by the pan. The salt raker learns to accept such mercies without depending on them. A good hour can turn difficult with a change in brine, a smoky draught, a careless splash, or the sudden stubbornness of crust along the pan's far edge. So, you take the easier movement while it lasts, letting the tool glide where it can, saving strength not because you are lazy, but because the day is long and will spend what you offer too freely. Near the furnace mouth, fuel settles with a low crackle, and the heat brightens under the iron. The pan responds almost at once, trembling harder at the center, and steam begins to rise in a thicker sheet that makes the room feel smaller. You angle your body slightly, not enough for anyone to notice a strategy, but enough to keep the worst of the steam from pressing straight into your face. There is a science in the work, though it is not the science of scrolls and instruments. It is a science of sight, sound, touch, smell, timing, and long repetition, learned where the skin meets heat and where the hand receives news through wood. The salt forms because water leaves, because dissolved mineral can no longer remain hidden, because flame, pan, and brine come together in a narrow bargain that the raker must watch without interruption. You know when the brine is nearly ready by the way the surface loses its open movement. Thin water rolls easily, but concentrated brine thickens into a heavier motion, and the crystals begin to gather as though the liquid itself has grown tired. The rake meets this change as a small resistance at first, then a fuller drag, and then the unmistakable grainy pull that means the pan must be cleared with steady hands. The blade scrapes lightly, and the sound travels through the handle into your wrist. You ease the salt toward the cooler edge, lift, draw back, and let the wetter portion slide away before gathering the crystals again. This motion is not hard to describe, yet describing it does not carry the heat, the sting, the cramped stance, or the patience required to do it hour after hour. Outside, someone leads an animal across the yard, and for a moment its hoofbeats enter the furnace house in soft, uneven knocks. The sound belongs to another rhythm, slower than boiling, freer than the scrape of rake on pan, and it passes by like a memory of roads. You glance up only briefly, because the salt has begun to mound, and the pan will not wait while your mind follows the animal into the morning light. The mound is lifted into a basket with a wet, heavy slide. Some of it clings to the rim, and you tap it free with the edge of the rake, careful not to scatter grains onto the dirty floor. The worker carrying it away shifts his grip under the weight, and the basket leaves a pale trail behind him, another line of salt returning the room to its own story. Every object in the salt house becomes marked by the work. Basket rims whiten, tool handles darken, pan edges roughen, floor stones glaze in places and crumble in others, and even the doorway posts collect smudges where tired shoulders brush past. The building itself seems to labor, absorbing steam, smoke, heat, and mineral dust, until it looks less built than seasoned by use. The raker's body becomes seasoned too. Hair holds smoke, skin holds salt, nails hold ash, and the muscles learn the exact length of a reach across the pan. Over time, the person and the place come to resemble one another in small ways, both darkened by fire, whitened by mineral traces, and shaped by the same repeated motion. Mid-morning brings stronger light through the high gaps, and the steam turns briefly luminous. It curls around the rafters, thins near the door, gathers in pockets, and slips upward where the roof lets it go. The sight might seem peaceful to someone standing far enough from the heat, but from where you are, it is also the breath you must work through, damp and hot and salted at the edge. You lean into another pass, feeling your back protest with a dull, familiar pull. It is not a sharp pain, and therefore it is not granted much attention, because a day at the furnace is full of complaints the body makes without expecting an answer. You adjust your grip, turn the rake slightly, and allow the motion to lengthen through the arms rather than catching in the shoulders. An older worker once showed you that small adjustment, not as a lesson formally given, but as a correction made in passing. He placed his hand over yours, changed the angle, and said little, because long work often teaches through gestures too plain to become speeches. Since then, the adjustment has saved you more pain than you can count, and this is how knowledge moves through such places, quietly, from tired body to tired body. The furnace yard has its own elders, men who have learned where to stand, when to drink, what to ignore, and what never to ignore. They may not speak often, but their silence is not empty, it is full of watching. When one of them looks toward a pan for too long, younger workers notice, because age near a furnace is a record of having survived many small errors without letting them become large ones. You learn from these elders that a pan's trouble often begins softly. A little darkening near one edge, a faint smell of scorching mineral, a change in the scrape, a patch where the crystals do not move as freely as they should. These signs are easy to miss when tiredness has made the mind dull, but missing them can make the next hour harder, and hard places punish neglect with interest. So you watch the far corner now, where the heat has been strong since dawn. The rake reaches, gathers, and loosens, and the pan yields after a few patient strokes. There is no mark made for that success, no tally for trouble avoided, but the day is easier because of it, and many forms of skill exist only as the absence of things going wrong. The brine in the next vessel is darker, carrying some trace from its source or storage, and when it pours into the pan, the smell changes slightly. A worker beside you sniffs and nods, as if recognizing a familiar well or batch, and then turns back to his own work. These distinctions matter to the people inside the process, though to others, all brine may seem the same, just as all salt may later appear equally white in a jar. As the darker brine boils, it leaves more scum at the surface, and that has to be guided away or skimmed before it troubles the batch. You work gently at first, letting the impurities gather where they can be removed, because rough motion would only break them apart and spread them back through the pan. The task slows the rhythm, and slowing can be frustrating when output is watched, but haste would make poorer salt and more work later. This is another small way the job strains the worker. The best motion is sometimes slower than the demanded motion, and the raker has to live between care and pressure. Too much care may look like delay to someone counting baskets, while too much speed may spoil what the basket is meant to hold, and the person at the pan must find the narrow path between being blamed now and blamed later. The furnace room grows louder as more pans reach their working heat. The hiss becomes layered, and the different stages of boiling make a rough harmony, some thin and quick, some deep and heavy, some nearly dry and whispering under the rake. You listen across them without appearing to listen, because in a salt house the ear becomes a second pair of hands, touching what the eyes cannot always see through steam. A sudden splash strikes the floor near your foot. It is small, but everyone nearby notices the sound, and the worker at that pan shifts his grip with a muted expression of annoyance rather than fear. The droplets steam briefly where they land, then leave pale marks that will soon be indistinguishable from all the others, because the salt house remembers accidents only until the next layer covers them. Your own wrist has a mark from such a splash, a narrow reddened place half hidden by dried mineral dust. It stings when sweat reaches it, and it will sting again when you wash, and by tomorrow it may be only another tender patch among many. The furnace gives small injuries generously, but because most are not severe, they become part of the background rather than events anyone would record. At midday, the first full weight of fatigue arrives. It does not come as collapse, but as a thickening of every action, as if the air has grown denser and each movement must push through more of it. The rake feels longer, the pan wider, the basket farther away, and the water vessel, though close enough to see, seems to belong to a future moment that keeps moving ahead of you. When the chance comes, you drink. The water is warm from the room, and it carries the taste of its container, but it loosens the throat and returns a little softness to the mouth. For a few breaths afterward, even the heat feels more distant, and then the furnace draws near again, surrounding you with the patient persistence of a season rather than a single flame. You eat beside the wall, where the shade is not cool but at least less bright. The food is plain enough that it does not ask for thought, and perhaps that is why it suits the moment, giving strength without waking the mind too sharply. You taste salt there too, in the food, on your fingers, in the air, and it becomes impossible to know whether the flavor belongs to the meal or to the day itself. Noon talk is sparse. Someone mentions a pipe that may need repair, someone says the brine from one well has been weaker this week, and someone else says nothing because his mouth is full and his eyes are nearly closed. The furnace continues behind you all, and even during eating it remains the center of the room, like a large warm animal whose breathing everyone has learned to live around. When you return to the pan, the first motion feels heavier than it should. Rest has reminded the body that it is tired, and the body briefly resents being asked to become useful again. But the brine is already clouding, and resentment has no place to go, so it passes into the handle, into the blade, into the slow sweep that draws the crystals into order. The afternoon's work is often less clean, not because the worker cares less, but because every part of the body has already spent some of its steadiness. A hand lingers too long, a foot slips slightly, a stroke becomes too short, or the eyes fail to catch a patch thickening near the edge. None of this need ruin the batch, but each correction takes effort. And effort in the afternoon comes from a deeper, less generous store. The raker's mind narrows then, choosing simplicity as a form of survival. Pan, edge, rake, basket, water, breath, not in sharp little pieces, but in a slow-turning circle of attention that returns to the necessary things before thought wanders too far. The world beyond the salt house still exists, but for now it is folded away because the body has only enough room for the work in front of it. There is comfort in knowing the sequence. Fresh brine, warming surface, first foam, cloudy gathering, gentle draw, heavier drag, mounding salt basket lifted, pan cleared, and another pour to begin again. The sequence is wearying, but it is also a rope through the day, and you hold it without thinking because letting go would leave the hours too shapeless. Outside, clouds begin to gather over the basin, bringing a damp heaviness to the air. The change reaches the furnace house slowly, as a faint pressure and a shift in smell, and someone near the doorway glances upward with concern. Rain is not always a disaster, but damp weather complicates drying, storing, fuel, footing, and mood, and in salt work, the sky is never entirely outside the process. The fresh mounds must be watched more closely when damp air comes. Salt that seemed ready can soften, baskets can grow sticky, and storage areas need better covering than anyone feels like arranging after a long shift. The raker may return to the pan, while others move covers or boards, but he knows the worry, because every grain drawn from water seems to carry a secret wish to return to it. A low rumble moves somewhere beyond the hills, too distant to startle, more like a cart crossing a wooden bridge than thunder. The workers hear it and continue, because weather rarely grants permission to stop before it arrives fully. Steam rises, smoke lowers, and the air grows so heavy that sweat no longer dries well, leaving the skin slick beneath the salt-crusted cloth. The pan thickens badly in the damp pressure, or perhaps it only seems so because your hands are tired. You work a stubborn strip along the near edge, leaning carefully, feeling the rake catch and release, catch and release. The rhythm is not smooth now, but it is still rhythm, and even uneven rhythm can carry a worker forward when the day has become thick. Another worker steps close with a scraper to help loosen the crust. Together you clear the edge, one tool lifting while the other draws, and the salt comes away in flakes that look dry on top and wet underneath. The shared effort is brief, but it lightens the task, and afterward neither of you says much beyond a small nod that means both thanks and let us keep going. That nod is part of the furnace language. There are nods for move aside, for lift now, for this pan is catching, for the overseer is watching, for drink while you can, and for I have seen the trouble you just saved. Words exist too, of course, but heat makes economy wise, and bodies that work together learn to speak in small signs. Rain begins outside, soft at first, touching the yard with a sound almost delicate compared with the furnace. It darkens the packed earth, stipples the brine vessels, and turns dust into a smell so cool and familiar that it reaches into the salt house like a hand from another world. For a moment, the scent of wet ground mingles with smoke and brine, and the contrast is so pleasant it nearly aches. You cannot go stand in it. The pan is thick, the salt is ready, and the basket is waiting. So you remain by the heat while the rain cools the yard. And this is one of the small cruelties of the job, that relief may be visible through the doorway and still unavailable. The rain makes the doorway shine, and beyond it the yard blurs. Workers outside move faster, covering salt, shifting baskets, protecting fuel, and calling softly through the wet air. Inside you draw another mound from the pan, and the fresh crystals steam in front of you, as though they carry their own weather in answer to the sky. The day becomes divided between water falling from above and water leaving the pan below. Rain descends in cool drops, steam rises in hot veils, and between them the salt raker stands, trying to keep the mineral world from dissolving back into liquid. It is a plain arrangement, but it feels almost symbolic if one is tired enough to notice symbols in ordinary labor. The storm passes slowly, never fierce, only persistent. The roof finds its leaks, as roofs always do, and someone places a vessel beneath a steady drip near the wall. That sound joins the others, drop after drop, patient and hollow, while the furnace continues its hotter rhythm and the rake moves through a world made of too much water and not enough rest. When the rain weakens, the yard smells newly washed, but the furnace house smells stronger than before. Damp air holds smoke lower, and the brine's sharpness seems to cling to the tongue. You breathe through it because there is no better choice, and the body, practical as ever, keeps what complaints it cannot solve in a quiet corner. By late afternoon, the salt made during the rain has to be handled with more care. Some of it is slower to dry, and the workers spread it where warmth and moving air can reach it without dirt. You watch for a moment as someone breaks a damp clump by hand, and the crystals fall apart reluctantly, bright and coarse and still carrying heat from the pan. There is something humbling about how easily work can be undone. A poor cover, a wet floor, an overfull basket, a leaky roof, or a careless step can spoil the clean separation that took fire and labor to achieve. So everyone becomes attentive in different ways, guarding not only the process of making salt, but the fragile condition of salt after it has been made. The furnace raker's own attention returns to the next pan. This one is nearing completion, and the surface has become thick enough that the rake no longer glides but pushes. You take longer strokes, drawing the crystals in ribbons, then shorter ones near the edge, where too much pressure would splash what remains of the bitter liquid. The muscles of your forearms feel swollen with use, though they look much the same as they did in the morning. Work often changes the body from within before the eye can see it, filling the limbs with heaviness, heat, and small tremors that appear only when the tool is set down. You do not set it down yet, because the pan is almost clear, and almost is a word that keeps tired people moving. At last, the pan shows dark beneath the salt. You clear the last damp ridges, guide them toward the basket, and watch the crystals slump into the waiting container. The carrier lifts, turns, and walks away into the smoky, damp light, bearing the pan's finished hour on his shoulder. Another pour follows. There is always another pour, unless the shift has truly ended, and the sound of it enters you with a mixture of resignation and steadiness. Fresh brine spreads, thin and shining, and the whole cycle starts again with such calm indifference that you almost admire it. The world of the Han Salt Works depends on this indifference. The brine does not care whether a dynasty rules wisely, whether an official is fair, whether a worker slept poorly, or whether rain has made the yard troublesome. It responds to heat, to surface, to concentration, and to time, and the human beings around it must arrange their hopes, tempers, and bodies around those facts. That can be comforting in a narrow way. Fire heats, water leaves, salt remains, and the process obeys itself with a steadiness that no person can negotiate. When so much of life depends on rank, order, weather, chance, and command, the pan's plain chemistry may feel almost honest, even while it makes the room miserable. As evening approaches, the rain clouds thin, and a pale band of light opens near the horizon. It enters the furnace house low and soft, crossing the wet floor in a muted shine and touching the salt crusts along the pan edge. For a few breaths, the whole room seems gentler, though nothing has changed except the angle of light and the workers' longing for the end. The overseer's count comes late because the rain disturbed the handling. He moves among baskets and mounds, checking what can be checked, and the workers continue with the careful dullness of people too tired to perform attentiveness. He may understand that damp weather made the day harder, or he may only understand the amount before him, and either way the salt has to answer in measures. You keep your eyes on the pan. It is safer not to watch the count too closely, because the body cannot change what has already been lifted. The rake moves, the surface clouds, and the thought of numbers floats somewhere behind you, present but less immediate than the crust forming near the far edge. A child appears briefly at the doorway, perhaps carrying a message or looking for someone, and the furnace light touches his face. He squints into the steam, sees the workers as shapes around heat, and then slips away, leaving only the impression of smallness beside such constant labor. Many children near such places learn early that grown people are sometimes claimed by work so fully that even affection must wait until the pan is cleared. The thought follows you for a while. Maybe someone waits for you too, or maybe no one does. And in either case, the shift has its own demands. The salt house is not cruel in the manner of a person. It is worse and easier than that, simply continuing, simply requiring, simply being the place where necessity becomes heat. The final hour moves slowly. It stretches around every task, making the pan seem to thicken more slowly, the basket arrive more slowly, and the light outside fade more slowly than it should. Tiredness changes time this way, turning minutes into surfaces that must be scraped before they will let you pass. You begin to prepare your mind for ending, though the hands remain occupied. Clear the edge well, leave the rake clean enough, warn the next worker about the stubborn corner, drink before leaving if water remains, wash the wrist, find dry cloth if possible. These thoughts are not dreams of luxury, only small practical comforts, but they shine at the end of the day like lamps along a road. The last pan of your turn is not the easiest. It catches near the far side, and you have to lean into the long reach with more care than strength. The rake pulls against the crust. Your shoulders answer with a deep ache, and for a moment the work feels personal, as if this one patch of salt has waited all day to test the last of your patience. You do not fight it wildly. You breathe, loosen, work the edge, and let the tool worry the crust free little by little. When it releases, the feeling is so satisfying that you almost smile, though the room receives the victory without comment. The salt gathers, heavy and wet. You draw it to the side, and the basket worker comes close, placing his feet carefully on the damp floor. Together you move the last mound, and when the pan clears beneath it, the dark iron looks worn, hot, and strangely peaceful, as though it too has finished something for the day. You scrape the blade of the rake along a rough edge where old salt has hardened. The crystals break loose in small grains and flakes, dropping with soft ticks onto the floor or into the pan where they can be gathered. This cleaning is not separate from the job. It is part of the same long courtesy toward tomorrow, toward the next hand, and toward the pan that has endured the day with you. At last you set the rake aside. The handle leaves your hand with that same reluctant feeling, and the palms seem to pulse in the absence of it. You look down and see the pale lines where salt has dried, the red marks where wood pressed, and the faint trembling that comes when a muscle has worked longer than it wished. The room continues. Another worker steps toward the pan, and the furnace accepts him without pause. It is strange how quickly one person's long day becomes another person's immediate task, how little the process changes when a tired body withdraws and a different tired body enters the heat. You step back, then farther back, and the heap loosens one layer at a time. At the doorway, damp evening air meets you, and because rain has washed the yard, the smell of earth is strong enough to cover the salt for a few precious breaths. You stand there just long enough to feel the contrast. Warm back, cool face, sore hands, wet ground, and the soft grey sky opening above the saltworks. The yard is full of endings that are not complete endings. Covers are adjusted, baskets are moved, tools are placed under shelter, fuel is checked, and workers walk through puddles that reflect the last light. The day's production rests in guarded heaps, not yet entirely dry, not yet gone into the world, but no longer boiling in the pan. You wash your hands where water has been gathered, and the sting is immediate. It rises from small cracks, from the burn near your wrist, from places rubbed raw by cloth and handle, and then it fades into a cleaner ache. The water turns cloudy and runs off your fingers, carrying away a little of the furnace, though never all of it. The skin beneath the salt looks strangely tender, as if it belongs to someone who has been both hardened and softened by the same work. You rub carefully, not wanting to open what has begun to close, and then dry your hands on cloth that is itself not entirely clean. Perfect cleanliness belongs elsewhere, perhaps to imagination, perhaps to officials' descriptions, but not to the salt house at the end of a rainy day. Evening food waits somewhere beyond the yard, and the thought of it steadies you, not because the meal will be grand, but because it will be away from the pan, and because sitting with a bowl can feel like being returned to yourself. The body is simple in this way, and after heat, salt, smoke, rain, and labor, simple things become almost luminous. As you walk, the furnace sound recedes behind you. It does not vanish, but it becomes part of the general murmur of the works, mixed with water dripping from roofs, workers speaking softly, and the squelch of feet in damp earth. With every step, the scrape of the rake inside your muscles grows less commanding, though it remains there, waiting to become tomorrow's first familiar ache. The sky clears in strips. A pale star appears where the cloud has thinned, and smoke from the saltworks moves beneath it in low, slow ribbons. You look up only briefly, because looking up after a day bent over a pan can make the neck complain. But the sight is enough to remind you that the world is taller than the furnace roof. Perhaps that is one reason people endure narrow labor. Not because narrowness is good, and not because hardship is noble by itself, but because beyond the narrow place there is still evening, weather, food, voices, sleep, and a sky that belongs to no overseer. The furnace claims the hours, but it does not claim the whole world, even when exhaustion makes it feel that way. At the lodging, someone has set a lamp near the wall, and its flame is small and domestic, nothing like the furnace fire. It wavers when the door opens, steadies again, and lays a soft light over bowls, hands, cloth, and the low shapes of tired people. You sit, and the simple act of not standing becomes so pleasant that the body seems to sink toward the earth with gratitude. Food is eaten, words are exchanged, a laugh passes quietly from one person to another and fades before it grows large. The day's salt is present in the meal, not as burden now, but as taste, and for a while the harsh white crystals of the furnace become invisible, dissolved into broth, grain, vegetable, and warmth. Your hands wrap around the bowl, and the heat of it is different from furnace heat. It is held, chosen, close, and comforting, and it does not demand that you draw crystals from boiling water or stand in smoke. The contrast is small but deep, and the palms, so tired of gripping wood, seem to understand the gentler shape at once. Later, when the bowl is empty, the body begins its slow descent toward sleep. The shoulders loosen unevenly, the back settles, and the hands rest open, as if to prove there is no tool in them for the moment. Outside, the last drips fall from the roof, and the salt works beyond the dark continues in the distance, muted by rain-wet earth and night air. You may think of tomorrow, but not clearly. The thought has the shape of the rake, the pan, the heat, and the brine, yet it lacks sharp edges because sleep has already begun to soften it. Tomorrow will ask what tomorrow asks, and for now the day's work has reached the edge of your strength and stopped there. In the half-dream before sleep, the furnace house returns without its worst heat. Steam rises slowly, the rake moves easily, and the salt gathers in quiet white lines that do not sting or weigh too much. Dreams are not accurate records, and perhaps that is their kindness, making a gentler version of what the body has endured so the mind can lay it down. The real furnace remains beyond the dark. Its pans cool or boil according to the night's arrangement, its tools lean in their places, and its walls hold the smell of brine, smoke, and human labor. The salt made today rests under cover, drying patiently after rain, and the wells below keep their buried silence, waiting for morning hands to draw from them again. And you sleep, not because the work is done forever, but because it is done for now. The room around you settles, the lamp lowers, and the soreness in your hands becomes less like pain and more like a warm, distant echo. Somewhere beyond the walls, water still remembers salt, fire still remembers the pan, and the rake waits in the dark with its handle cooling slowly, ready for the next day's quiet burden.